All right, so are you ready to dive into some serious legal history?
Always up for a good deep dive.
This time, you've sent over some fascinating excerpts from F.W. Maitland's A Constitutional History of England.
Maitland.
A classic. And, this isn't going to be some dry, dusty textbook read.
Definitely not.
We're talking about, the real nitty-gritty of how power dynamics, have actually shifted throughout English history.
It's a fascinating journey, really. Maitland is just brilliant at cutting through the noise and getting to the core of why legal systems change.
It's about more than just, memorizing names and dates.
Exactly. It's about really understanding the pressures, the motivations behind those changes.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really kind of surprised me was how this whole concept of sovereignty, this idea of a single ruler or entity holding all the power, that wasn't always a given.
Right.
Maitland points out that this idea of sovereignty as we understand it today, it's relatively new.
It is, yeah. It emerged around the 17th century.
So if people weren't looking to a single all-powerful sovereign back then, how did they view power? What did they see as legitimate authority?
That's the question, isn't it? It's imagine trying to explain the internet to someone living in the Middle Ages.
Whoa, yeah.
It's almost that big of a shift in thinking. To really grasp their worldview, you have to kind of set aside a lot of our modern assumptions about government.
It's like trying to navigate without GPS.
Exactly.
You'd have to rely on local knowledge or word of mouth, maybe even the stars.
And in this case, instead of landmarks, you have this whole web of allegiances, obligations, often tied to land ownership.
Okay, so this is where feudalism comes in.
Exactly, feudalism.
Yep.
But we're not talking about the romanticized, knights in shining armor version.
Right.
We're talking about the real deal.
The nitty-gritty.
The gritty economic system, the bedrock of power in early England.
So let's ditch the Hollywood version then. What did Maitland actually reveal about how this system worked, in practice?
Well, picture this. You've got the king, right? He's at the top.
The big cheese.
Right. Theoretically, the ultimate landowner.
Okay.
But to actually manage everything and defend his territory, he starts giving out chunks of land.
Divvying up the kingdom.
Exactly. And we're talking prime real estate here.
Right.
He's giving it to his most trusted nobles.
Right. In exchange for
loyalty. They swear allegiance to the king.
Makes sense.
And promise to provide military service when he calls on them. These land grants, by the way, were called fiefs.
Fiefs. Okay. So it's kind of like a real estate deal, but with swords and shields thrown in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there.
It trickles down.
Absolutely. These nobles, who are now big-time landowners, they might break up their fiefs even further.
Giving out smaller portions.
Exactly. To lesser lords, knights, all in exchange for their loyalty and service. It's like a pyramid, but instead of selling, questionable products, they're trading oaths and military obligations.
And what about the average person? Where did they fit into all of this?
Most people found themselves on the bottom rung of this feudal ladder.
Working the land.
Exactly. Supporting those above them. Some were what were called freeholders.
Freeholders.
Meaning they had certain rights to their land.
Okay.
But they still owed, rent or services.
Yeah.
But many others were serfs.
Ah, serfs tied to the land.
Exactly. They owed labor and obedience to their lord.
Not a lot of upward mobility there.
Not really. But here's where it gets interesting. Maitland, he points out that England's version of feudalism, it wasn't a carbon copy of what you'd find in, say, France.
Really? So what made English feudalism so unique?
Well, for one thing, the church. They had significant power in England.
Right.
They often acted as a check on the king's authority.
Interesting.
And then there's this other intriguing point. Even within this system, seemingly built on land and military might, the seeds of representative government were being planted.
Wait, so you're telling me that the system designed to, maintain the status quo actually had within it the seeds of its own transformation?
Precisely. And those seeds would eventually blossom into a force to be reckoned with. Parliament.
Parliament. Okay, so we're talking about, the rise of, the people's voice?
Yeah.
Challenging this whole, feudal order?
You got it. It wasn't an overnight revolution, though. Think of it more like a long game of tug-of-war.
Okay, a tug-of-war, who's pulling on the rope?
You got the king on one side, the church kind of in the middle, and then these emerging representative bodies.
And they're all vying for
influence, control, the usual.
So what were some of those, key moments, those big polls that shifted the balance?
We go all the way back to Magna Carta.
Magna Carta, 1215, yeah.
Right, and I know you're thinking history lesson, here we go. But what's so interesting about Magna Carta It wasn't this radical overthrow of the monarchy. Right. It was more about, like, setting some ground rules.
Okay, ground rules, I like it.
Establishing this idea that even the king, he's not above the law.
So that was a big deal, right? Even just getting that down on paper.
Huge. And then you fast forward a bit. We get to the Model Parliament of 1295.
The Model Parliament, that sounds, I don't know, almost too good to be true.
Well, the name might be a bit misleading. It wasn't all smooth sailing from there.
Right, of course not. History's never that neat, is it?
Exactly. What's really important about the Model Parliament is who we see participating. For the first time, it's not just nobles, but also knights and representatives of towns.
Commoners.
A huge step towards broader representation.
Okay, so not perfect, but definitely progress.
Exactly. It's a process.
Right.
And what Maitland shows us is that progress isn't always a straight line.
More like one of those maps with all the winding roads.
Exactly. Full of detours. And sometimes those detours, they're these seemingly minor details that have these huge ripple effects.
Really? Like what?
Maitland talks about the standardization of legal language.
Legal language. Okay, that doesn't sound quite as exciting as, A Knight's Tale or something.
Maybe not, but it was crucial. Think about it. For centuries, legal proceedings were conducted in Latin and French.
Which most people didn't speak.
Exactly. So who benefits from that kind of obscurity?
Those in power.
Of course. But as English starts being used in the courts, the law becomes more accessible to everyday people.
It's like knowledge is power, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that shift had a profound impact on the balance of power.
Wow. So language, even something like that, can be a game changer.
Absolutely. And speaking of game changers, let's talk about two things that are always at the heart of power struggles. Money and the military.
The classic combo. Control those, and you control a lot.
Right. And in these excerpts you sent, it's clear that taxation, military might, those were central to how the monarchy and parliament interacted.
Okay, so let's talk taxes.
Everyone's favorite topic.
Right. Nobody likes paying them, but you gotta do what you gotta do.
Yeah.
So back then, how did kings keep their coffers full?
Well, imagine you're king, right? You need to fund a war, build a new castle.
Maintain that lavish lifestyle.
Exactly. They had a few ways to do it. Taxes on land were common.
Makes sense.
They could impose customs duties on goods coming in and out of the kingdom.
Control the trade routes.
Exactly. And then, of course, there were always gifts from wealthy nobles.
Oh, I bet those gifts came with, some unspoken pressure.
You could say that. But as you can imagine, these tactics, they didn't always go over well.
And that's where Parliament comes in.
You know it. They were not afraid to throw their weight around, especially when it came to money.
So tell me more about this financial tug-of-war. What were some of the key battles?
Well, Maitland talks about ship money, for example.
Ship money? What is that?
Basically, it was a tax to fund the Navy.
Sounds reasonable enough.
Right. But Parliament, they pushed back hard. They argued that imposing a tax like that required their consent.
They saw it as a threat to their authority.
Exactly. It's amazing to think that these early financial showdowns, they really laid the groundwork for the budget battles we see today.
Right. Like it's all connected.
It is. Those struggles back then, they established the principle of parliamentary control over government spending. And that's a principle that's still relevant today, even if the battlegrounds have changed a bit.
So it wasn't just about how much money the king could raise, but how that money was spent.
Absolutely. And that's where another development comes in. The civil list.
Okay, civil list. Break it down for me.
Essentially, it was an attempt to separate the king's personal expenses from the costs of running the government.
Interesting. So like giving the king an allowance.
Kind of. But the point was, it prevented the king from dipping into funds that were meant for, essential things.
Like roads, courts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, paying for the military.
Ah, yes, the military. Can't forget about that. How did Parliament manage the king's control over the army? So they wanted to make sure the king couldn't just go off on a conquest spree whenever he felt like it.
Exactly. And they realized that controlling the money meant controlling the army.
So how did that actually work in practice? Did Parliament have to approve every military decision?
Not quite. For a long time, the king was still seen as the commander-in-chief.
Makes sense.
And for centuries, the army was actually based on that feudal system we talked about.
Right, with the nobles providing soldiers.
Exactly. But as England evolved, that system started to become, outdated.
Yeah, I can imagine trying to run a war with, a bunch of knights who were obligated to be there because of some deal their great-great-grandfather made.
Not exactly efficient. Maitland points out that relying on nobles to, round up troops, it wasn't exactly a recipe for a well-oiled machine.
Especially as warfare was becoming more complex.
Exactly. They needed a more professional army.
Okay, so that means hiring, like professional soldiers, mercenaries.
Exactly, or even paying volunteers. But of course that gets expensive.
Cue the dramatic music because here comes another fight over money.
Right. Parliament was not thrilled about the idea of the king having this powerful, expensive army at his disposal.
They'd learned their lesson. They weren't going to give up that financial control.
Exactly, so they used it as leverage. The king needs money for his army. He has to go through Parliament.
So those early struggles over funding, they helped establish the principle of parliamentary control over the military.
Exactly. And that's something we still see as a cornerstone of many democracies today. But Maitland doesn't stop there. He goes beyond the king and Parliament and looks at how other parts of the government were changing too.
It's like watching a company evolve, right? From a small startup to this, huge corporation with different departments and everything.
That's a great analogy. He talks about the Privy Council.
The king's advisors.
Yeah, and how their influence went up and down over time. And then there's the rise of different government departments like the Exchequer, which was responsible for, collecting taxes, managing the royal treasury.
Ah, so England's bureaucracy was starting to take shape. All the fun stuff, like departments and, paperwork.
Exactly. And don't even get me started on the courts. The legal system was becoming much more complex, with different courts specializing in different types of cases.
It's amazing how it all evolved from this, relatively simple system based on land and loyalty.
Right. It became this intricate web. But Maitland reminds us that it wasn't always a smooth transition.
There are growing pains.
Definitely. Overlapping jurisdictions, competing interests. It was messy. And that's important to remember because history is rarely neat and tidy.
Definitely. Speaking of messy, I loved that little detail Maitland threw in about the sheriff.
Oh, yeah.
How that position went from being this incredibly powerful figure to, a largely ceremonial role.
It's a great example of how power dynamics can shift in unexpected ways. As the central government gained more power, the sheriff's role diminished.
That makes you wonder what people will find strange about our systems, hundreds of years from now.
Right. What will seem totally baffling. That's part of what makes studying history so fascinating. It gives you this whole new perspective, not just on the past, but on the present too.
So let's talk about that. How does all of this whole journey through English legal history, how does it still affect us today?
Well, think about something as basic as property.
Okay.
That concept, the idea of owning land, it has its roots in those early feudal relationships we talked about.
Wow. So those battles they fought over land, over who had the right to grant it, take it away, all of that, it shaped how we view property today.
Absolutely. And then there's the legacy of Parliament's fight for control over finances, the military.
Right.
Those early struggles, they established principles of accountability, the rule of law, things that are still so important today.
It's like those early parliaments. They were laying the groundwork for democracy as we know it.
Exactly. And that legacy continues to shape debates today. Every time we talk about government transparency or the limits of power, we're engaging with questions that have their roots in those early power struggles.
It's like Maitland is giving us this amazing roadmap, this guide to understanding not just the past, but the present as well.
He really is. He encourages us to think critically, to connect the dots between seemingly unrelated events.
And he leaves us with this really interesting idea, this concept that England didn't actually have a true quote-unquote feudal system. It was more this unique, evolving legal landscape.
It's a great reminder that history isn't always black and white, right? It's full of complexities and contradictions.
Definitely. So as we wrap up, I think it's safe to say that Maitland's work, it offers us this really valuable lens through which we can examine history, government, even our own lives today. It's a reminder that the past isn't really past, it's always present, shaping the world around us in ways we might not even realize.
Absolutely. It's a reminder to keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and to never take anything for granted.
Well said. And on that note, thanks for joining me on this deep dive into English legal history.
My pleasure. Always enjoy a good deep dive with you.